Hello everyone, welcome back to the School of Taste. I am Nick Jackson. I'm very pleased to be here with you again today. Welcome to the second session of Wine Tasting by Structure. If you are returning after last week, then welcome back. If you are new, perhaps you missed out last week, but you can join us this week, then thank you for attending. We're very happy to have you. And if you're watching on recording, then you're very welcome also. Thank you for doing that. So as always, please type your questions or your comments in the questions using the questions function, and I will see your comments there, and I will try and read out as many as I can, so you can kind of get an impression of what everyone else is talking about. I'm always interested to hear what you guys are thinking about the wines and get your feedback. I always learn as much from you guys as you do from me, so that's always fun for me. Okay, so today's session, 3 more white grape varieties where we can discuss acid structure in these varieties, and Chardonnay, Pinot Gris, Cortese. I hope what we're going to find is that these 3 varieties have got acid structures which are quite different to what we experienced last week when we were looking at Chenin Blanc and Sauvignon Blanc and Assyrtiko. I started with those 3 varieties last week because I think they have quite stark, almost dramatic acid structures. These ones perhaps less so this week, but I now think after your introduction last week, you're going to be well prepared to take on perhaps these slightly more tricky acid structures to identify and understand. So without further ado, let us move on with our slide here. Now this is a slide familiar to you from last week. This is just a little reminder of what we're looking at with acid structure. But for those people who weren't with us last time around, this is essentially what I look for, the basis of what I look for when we're talking about acid structure in white wines. So I break it down into 3 categories, all of which I want us to think about for each wine that we look at today. The first category is simply the level of acidity. Is the level of acidity in this particular wine low, moderate, high? And the simple way to assess that is simply how much does it make your mouth water? I think this is something which we're all used to, any of us who've studied any kind of wine qualifications. And even if you haven't, you think about a high acid variety like a Sauvignon Blanc, for instance, always makes your mouth water a lot. That's a classic example of a wine with high acidity. Of course, that can depend a little bit on the climate the variety is grown in. But in general, some varieties like Sauvignon Blanc, like Riesling, are simply going to have higher acidity than some others. And that's actually going to be quite relevant for at least a couple of the varieties we're going to start out by talking about today. The next aspect of acid structure that I want us to think about is the type of acidity. And again, this is perhaps a little bit more abstract than simply the level of acidity in your wine. But my argument is that I think that acidity in white wines can have a certain texture or a sensation which is particular to it, to that variety. So our task when we're considering type of acidity is to try and come up with an adjective, a word that best describes, that best captures the sensation or the texture of that acidity when we have the wine in our mouth. We hold the wine in our mouth for 4 or 5 seconds to try and extract everything that we can from it. And then we can give our impressions about the type of acidity. So I don't know, just to use one example from here, zesty acidity, for instance. Zesty is a bit like if you were chewing on a lime pith. That's kind of zesty, kind of alive and vibrant. But we'll talk about that more when we have the wines in front of us. So level of acidity, type of acidity, it's got high zesty acidity. Now you see that even when you do that, you're narrowing down the possible options for what the variety could be. You've already got rid of a number of possible candidates and you're just narrowing it down. And then the final category, which should narrow it down even further, is this concept of acid shape. Again, this is certainly the most difficult one to get your head around. So don't sweat it if you don't get it right away. But in general, what we're thinking about with the shape of acidity is this idea that sometimes you have varieties where you feel the acidity all at the same level, the same intensity throughout the time the wine spends on your palate. And so because it's like a line, just a straight line with no ups and downs, because the intensity stays the same, that line we call a linear acid profile. By contrast, other varieties might have acidity which is felt particularly strongly and then weak and then comes up again on the end. So that is an example where it's got peaks and troughs. So if you're going to plot that on a graph, it would kind of look like a wave. So that's a very different shape of acidity compared to the horizontal linear acidity. And so our task when the wine is in your mouth for those 5 seconds is to think about, is the level of acidity that I'm getting consistent all the time, or did I feel it particularly at the beginning or particularly at the end? And then I just want to add one more layer to that, as if this isn't complicated enough already, and say also under this category of shape, think about physically in your mouth where you feel that acidity most strongly. Because for instance, if you feel it around the edge of your mouth, that can also create a sense of shape, like a circle or a ring or a sphere, if it's all around the edge of your mouth like that. So just have that in the back of your mind as well. So those are the 3 elements of acid structure. And again, according to my theory, my proposal, which I outline in my book, Beyond Flavor, if you combine those 3, level, type, and shape of acidity, then you're really not going to have many options because each major variety has got a slightly different acid structure. And so if you can identify these different categories correctly, then you've got a very good chance of being in the right place if someone just puts a glass of wine in front of you and says, what's the variety? So let's, if there's no questions about all that, let's get started with our first wine, which today is Chardonnay. While we pour the Chardonnay, let me just say a couple of words about it. I often start these kind of webinar sessions with Chardonnay, but I decided not to this time because I thought that last week's wines could be a bit more expressive of acid structure. I think we're about to find out that Chardonnay nonetheless has got a very interesting acid structure, but it may just be a little bit more difficult to perceive perhaps than some of the ones we did last week. But now that you're trained, I think you're going to get this without too much difficulty. So like I always do, what we'll do first, I think, is to just taste for flavors and aromas. Again, the reason why I always do this, even though we're not ultimately going to talk about that, is just so we can get it out the way, because our mind always wants to think about flavors and aromas. So if we do that first, then we can lay it aside and then just focus on structure. So when you're tasting and smelling for flavor and aroma, please tell me in the questions box what flavors, aromas you're getting, but also add which region your wine comes from, because that's going to be very relevant to the kind of flavors and aromas you're getting. So please go ahead and do that. Okay, so Kathleen has got a Napa example. Excellent. Luciana is in Macon in France. Very good. Okay, so Kathleen in Napa is getting popcorn, ripe pineapple, lemon curd, and caramel. It sounds like a pretty full-on example of Chardonnay, Kathleen. Maria has got one from Sonoma, which is showing stone fruit and some new French oak. Again, that sounds right for that region of origin, a warm region of origin, often with some pretty good amounts of oak use. Fred is in Puy-Frisé, perhaps a bit warmer Puy-Frisé than, say, Chassagne-Montrachet or Chablis, but nonetheless should be a classic example of French Chardonnay. Kathleen is getting some oak notes from her wine from Napa Valley. From Saint-Véran, Louise has got a Saint-Véran, which has got some honey melon, chamomile, stony minerality, and pear. That sounds like a delicious wine, Louise. Shengli has got a Chablis Premier Cru, very nice, with apple, pear, lemon zest, oyster shell, and chalky minerality. That sounds perfect. I love Chablis, one of my go-to wines. It sounds like you've got a very nice one there, Shengli, and it sounds like a classic example. Stanislav's has got an Australian Chardonnay with ripe stone fruit and a slightly bitter finish. Very good. Okay, guys, so flavors and aromas, excellent. So let's talk about acid now in the Chardonnay. So what's the level of acidity in your wine? Just tell me what kind of level you're getting, and again, just mention where the wine is coming from. Okay, so let's see what we have here. Vitali's got a New Zealand example of Chardonnay, which is delicious. I love that. And Kathleen is getting a medium or moderate acidity from her Napa Valley Chardonnay. And Louise is getting medium plus from Saint Veron. Maria has got high acidity in her Sonoma example. Corey is also in New Zealand, and he's getting medium plus. So we seem to be getting somewhere between medium to occasionally high, but generally medium, medium plus, just the occasional high example. I mean, that sounds about right to me. If you think about Chardonnay in the abstract, you don't immediately think about acidity. You know, maybe if we're in Champagne or perhaps in Chablis in the northern parts of France, sure. But really, if you say the word Chardonnay, the first thing I think about isn't acidity. It's probably about sort of fruitiness, the generous, soft fruit that you often get from Chardonnay. Okay, let's see what you guys are saying. Jean-Luc has got medium acidity in his Bourgogne Blanc. Lydia has got high acidity from her Chablis, very good. And Ruma has got medium plus from the south of France. Good, that all makes sense. Okay, so that's all easy enough. I think most of us are in the ballpark of medium to medium plus with the occasional high. Now let's think about the type of acidity. What's an adjective that you would use to describe the sensation or the texture of the acidity in your mouth? Of course, I understand that, you know, acidity is always fresh and mouth-watering and things like that, but can we be a bit more specific? I've given some examples on this slide of the type of acidity that you can get in different white wines. You can use those words if you want to, but you can also use your own. Okay, so Kathleen is saying that her Napa Valley wine has got linear acidity, so maybe a bit like the example I was giving at the top of this presentation about the wine with the straight line of acidity, which means there's no peaks and troughs. So the level or the intensity of the acidity remains constant, just a straight line all the way through the wine of acidity. I think Corey is in the same ballpark when he says consistent. So far we have consistent and linear. And Louise says hers has got broad acidity. She says, as if the acidity is coating the mouth without being spiky or zesty. Interesting, isn't it? Because spiky or zesty is kind of like, it's like a burst, like here and here and here. But Louise is saying it's not like that. She says it's just broad and it just coats the mouth. It's kind of everywhere. Maria, I think, is in the same ballpark, firm. Gianluca is going with consistent. So consistent, again, I think it's probably in the same kind of ballpark as linear because it's consistent, meaning it's at the same level. I think that's what you mean, Gianluca. Shengli is asking a technical question about the ratio of TA and pH, and Shengli, I think the simple answer is no. Let's not go down that rabbit hole just now, but I think the simple answer to your question is no. Chablis, video Chablis, the shape of the acidity is linear again and broad. Ruma, the intensity is the same from the start to the finish, consistent. Yeah, so a lot of people are saying the same thing about the consistent level of acidity. Not peaks and troughs, not spiky or jagged or zesty, but just very consistent. A couple more people saying linear. And Fred is noting that he finds the acidity particularly on the middle of the palate, right down the middle, not on the edges of the mouth. Sure. Okay, very good. I think you guys are doing great. I don't have much to disagree with you there. Let's just pull up my slides, see where I came down. Here we go. Level of acidity, I think for me, more than for a lot of varieties, Chardonnay is very dependent on where it's grown. So like I was saying, if you're in northern France, obviously you're going to be in the ballpark of at least moderate, even high acidity. You know, one major production zone for Chardonnay that we kind of might forget about is Champagne, of course. And, you know, Champagne, if it's made from Blanc to Blanc from Chardonnay, consistently has high, even very high acidity. Then if you go to my homeland in England, where English sparkling wine is now so increasingly important, again, a lot of Chardonnay there. And that has got spine-tingling acidity, really, really racy acidity. Compare that, for instance, Kathleen has got a Napa example, and that would be the other end of the spectrum, right? You know, we're a lot further south, a lot warmer climate, of course, and the acidity is just a bit softer. So it depends on climate, but I think anywhere from moderate to high is generally a safe bet. I think even in places like Napa, you really need at least moderate acidity, and winemakers know that. You don't want to have a soft, flabby wine. So moderate acidity is almost always preserved in spite of the warm climate. The type of the acidity, yeah, I think you guys said it really firm. We had firm, didn't we? We had broad. The way I try and explain broad, not as in kind of fat, but as in kind of broad shouldered, like the acidity is kind of holding up the rest of the wine. It's what gives the sense of shape to it. Of course, we always, you know, in a conversation about structure, we expect the acid structure to give a shape to the wine, but I think it's particularly evident in Chardonnay. It's got this very broad shouldered, broad structured variety where the fruit is never flabby, because the acidity, this linear, consistent, firm acidity, just shoots all the way through the middle of the wine. So that brings us to the shape, and yeah, so again, you guys have got it down. So this is my go-to classic example of linear acidity. So like the line of acidity, just totally constant, same level all the way through. And that's also why I call this linear acidity horizontal, because it's not like that, it's like that, as if it's from a journey, it's on a journey from here to here, right? So during the time the wine spends on your palate, the acidity gives a sense of direction to the wine. What do I mean by that? The wine doesn't sit heavy on your palate or ponderous or weighty, even in the warm climate examples of Chardonnay. It always feels like it's going somewhere. It's got a sense of direction. And what's propelling it along is this horizontal linear acidity, which drives from the time the wine first hits the front of your mouth all the way through to after you've spat or swallowed. So it's like, it's a very directional acidity. The acidity gives a direction to Chardonnay. Chardonnay is always a wine that's going somewhere. It's got a purpose. The other one, which we haven't mentioned yet so much, although someone was saying that, Fred was saying that the wine acidity is felt on the middle of the palate rather than around the edges, so maybe on the tongue, things like that, is this concept of the acidity in Chardonnay being well integrated into the body of the wine or the fruit of the wine. So I want you guys to think back to when we were doing Sauvignon Blanc last week, and if you weren't there for that session, I apologize for the plot spoiler, but we found out that that Sauvignon Blanc, you feel the acidity really around the edges of the mouth, or at least that's where it ends up after you spat or swallowed. But what we noticed in that wine was that the fruit of the wine is kind of in the middle of your palate, on your tongue, but then the acidity is around the edges. So there's a kind of disjunction between the fruit here and the acidity, which is around the edge. So that would be an example of a wine where the acidity is not integrated into the fruit. The fruit is in one place and the acidity is in another. But Chardonnay couldn't be more different. Chardonnay is totally integrated into the fruit. Whether it's a Chablis or a Napa example, you'll always find the fruit wrapping around the acidity, almost as if to sort of hide the acidity, as if to conceal it and wrap it up in fruit. But of course, because of the reasons I just said, that Chardonnay's acidity is firm and broad shoulders, you can't really ever hide the acidity in Chardonnay, as the example of Champagne points out so well. A very good question from Shengli. When you're doing all this assessment of acidity and the shape of acidity, do you swish the wine around in your mouth, or do you just let it sit there? I prefer to swish. I'm a swisher for sure. I do think that gets the most out of the wine. But if my theories are right, then I don't think it should make too much difference. But whenever I taste wine for professional purposes, I always swish it around. I think that's how you get the most out of it. And certainly that's what I would recommend here. So linear, we talked about. Horizontal, yes. Well integrated into the fruit of the wine. Now, I don't think anyone has got Champagne today, but under other terms, I've mentioned laser-like. You know, this is almost a sort of the extension or the exaggeration of linear, which would be, it's so focused and so intent on getting to the finish of the wine. It's like a laser, it's just pointing where to go very, very powerfully. So you get that in Champagne and English sparkling wine, in other cool regions, especially for sparkling wine when the ripeness is a bit lower and the acidity is a bit higher perhaps than in table wines. Taut is another aspect of that same thing. You often hear people describe a Chardonnay as being taut. That means that, imagine like a piece of string, it's not hanging limply, but it's being stretched out. It's taut, and that's, again, the line of acidity that courses through the heart of Chardonnay. I think we talked about focused. It's got a focus, it's got a direction. Precise. Precise, what I mean by precise is that the acidity doesn't feel like it does in Sauvignon Blanc, where it's around the edge of the mouth and it's here and it's here and it's here. It's really in the middle of the fruit and not anywhere else. It's precisely there. But also because of how consistent the acidity is in Chardonnay, that makes it quite precise in terms of its location within the fruit. So these are all just terms that I'm just spinning out different words, different adjectives, in case some of them resonate more with you than others. And again, let's draw a contrast, for instance, with the Chenin Blanc last week, where we noticed that that wine didn't feel like it had much acidity at the beginning, but then it crescendoed and grew and increased towards the end. That's quite a stark acid structure. Chardonnay here, I think you can see it's got a very different acid structure with the very consistent level of acidity. And this is my kind of my silly joke about Chardonnay, just to help us all remember a little better, is that because the acidity is so consistent and so reliable, Chardonnay is the reliable friend when it comes to acid structure. And that's my reliable friend on the left of this slide. Okay, questions. Stanislav is remarking that he had an English sparkling wine last night and it had laser-like acidity. Fred is saying that in the case of Champagne, the acidity is enhanced by the presence of carbon dioxide in the bubbles. Fred, I would just to be a little pedantic about it, the acidity remains at the same level, whether or not it's got bubbles in it. It's just the perception of it may be elevated by the presence of those bubbles, for sure. Luciana, can we make Chardonnay the benchmark of firm acidity and compare all other white varieties to it? Yes, 100%. I love the fact that Chardonnay, which is probably the world's most important white grape variety, has got such a clear and prominent and easy to understand acid structure. It's a benchmark for firm, horizontal, linear acid structure. So whatever terms on this slide speak to you and you understand them in the context of what you're tasting, take those terms, connect them with Chardonnay, and use those as your benchmark for this kind of acid structure. Sure. Okay, so Louise is asking a question about champagne. Can this theory, my theory about acid structure, can be used to see if a champagne is made from Chardonnay or Pinot Noir? Absolutely. It's a wonderful opportunity if you guys ever have the opportunity to do it, to taste a Blanc de Blanc and a Blanc de Noir next to each other. And you'll see that Pinot Noir just doesn't have the directional acidity. What Pinot Noir has in Champagne is that it has a concentrated mid-palate, which means that on the tongue, you feel this kind of concentration of fruit, especially red fruit, which Chardonnay never has in Champagne, because Chardonnay is always in such a race to get to the finish with that directional acidity that it leaves the mid-palate behind. It's got quite a light mid-palate compared to Pinot Noir. So again, we've talked in the past about blending and the importance of varieties compensating for each other. In Champagne, I believe that what is happening is that the Chardonnay is supplying the direction, the energy, and the vibrancy to the wines, and the Pinot Noir is supplying the fruit. Obviously, that's an oversimplification. They both supply a bit of both, but in general terms, I think it could be kind of useful to think about it like that. Okay, so I think we're ready for our next wine, Pinot Gris or Pinot Grigio. So why don't you guys pour that, and then we'll do aromas and flavors for that wine. And let's just do the same thing. Tell me where your example comes from, so I've got a little bit of context for the aromas and flavors that you're describing. Okay, I'm just going to put it back on this slide so we can see our cues here. Shengli's got an Alsace. I too have an Alsace example. So has Video. Kathleen's got a Fuley. Very nice. Okay, great. Oregon. Oregon is also like an increasingly interesting place for Pinot Gris. I think in general terms, if you guys, maybe some of you guys in Europe have not experienced Oregon Pinot Noir before, very basically it's the Alsace style of Pinot Gris, not the kind of Northern Italy Pinot Grigio style. It's more full-bodied. Jean-Luc is getting apple, pear, and peach on his Alsace. Vidia is noting the color of the wine is slightly pink, absolutely, and that's because the Pinot Gris berries have got this pink hue to them. They look pink on the vine, and so if you have any skin contact at all, then that color will come out into the finished wine to the point where the wine can even look almost like a little bit like a rosé. And Kathleen's got whetstone, lime, lemon, honey, honeysuckle. Fred's got a very nice Grand Cru from Alsace, so Fred's going to tell us all the answers to this one because he's got the best wine. Louise has got mature red apple bread, funky aromas from Oregon. Excellent, sounds delicious. Corey's also got an Oregon example with deep, rich orchard fruit. That deep, rich orchard fruit, that's the kind of the Alsace style I'm talking about that you get in Oregon. Full-bodied, I would guess as well. Stanislav's from Alsace, apricots, peach, other orchard fruits, rich and heavy. Yes, sounds about right. Maria from Alto Adige, floral and spicy. Yeah, so we can talk about this a little bit, but I don't think, for me, I don't think Pinot Grigio, excuse me, is an aromatic variety, just in the same way that I don't think Chardonnay is an aromatic variety. When I said that in another session, someone did ask me what I meant by that. Sometimes it can be helpful to categorize varieties in white wines into whether they're aromatic or not. So Sauvignon Blanc, aromatic. Viognier, aromatic. And then non-aromatic wines would be things like Muscadet or Aligoté, things like that. But a lot of varieties, I think, like Chardonnay or like Pinot Gris, I call them semi-aromatic, which means they do have some, excuse me, some fruity aromas, but they're not abundant and crazy like Gewürztraminer or Viognier or Sauvignon Blanc. Anyway, so that was just by the by, but Maria was saying her wine is floral and spicy. So I do think that sometimes from Alto Adige, you can get particularly aromatic styles for a basically not very aromatic variety, Alto Adige. Full body, apricots, honey, yes, sounds right for Alsace. And then Fred, intense dried fruits, honey, slightly oxidative, oxidative notes, those kind of dried fruit notes. You often do get that in Alsace, I think. Certainly those notes wouldn't be present in New World examples, which have got such a preference for purity and primacy of fruit, but French examples, sometimes you do find a flirtation with oxidation in these big, rich, full-bodied white wines. Okay, so good. All you guys sound like you've got very good classic examples. So let's think about acidity now. What's the level of acidity in your wine? And think about this one carefully, because particularly for the people with the big Alsace full-bodied examples, or the people in Oregon, the same situation, often the fruit is so powerful that somehow the acidity gets a little bit concealed. But try and dig beneath that fruit and really try and detect the level of the acidity. Louise, does Oregon behave like a European wine? Well, I'm comparing it to Alsace in the style, but I still think Oregon should have more fruit purity than European wines, even if it's got the same full body and slightly rich, oily texture. I think winemakers from the US always want to have purity of fruit, more so than French winemakers do. So I wouldn't say it's a European style wine. I'm just comparing it to a certain European region, which is Alsace. Okay, medium plus, high. Yeah, so Maria has got high acidity. She's an Alto Adige, so that makes sense. I do think that those examples from Alto Adige have some of the highest acidity of any examples of Pinot Grigio, for sure. Oregon, Louise is getting high acidity, good. Some medium pluses as well, excellent. Okay, and then let's think about the type of acidity. Can you find an adjective which best describes what the sensation or the texture of that acidity is in your mouth? I know you have to go kind of digging for it a little bit because there's so much fruit in the way if you've got a Pinot Gris style, but just focus on what the sensation of that acidity gives you. Corey says high acidity, but not as high as Chenin Blanc, sure. Vidya says zesty or spiky for the sensation or the type of the acidity. Corey has got prickly. Kathleen's got zesty. And Maria has got firm. Very good. I love all those. Luciana is commenting that the acidity is felt on the front of the tongue, the front of the mouth. Sure. Okay. And then finally, let's just think about the shape of the acidity. As Luciano was just mentioning, is there a certain place in the mouth where you feel it? Does that give it a shape of any kind? And like going back to our graph, again, is it steady or is it ups and downs? Do you feel it particularly at the beginning, at the end, or is it just consistent? Okay, so Kathleen is arguing that it's linear. So using exactly the same word as the the Chardonnay. Okay, Louise is saying firm and strong, especially at the end, meeting up at the front of the mouth and the back of the gums. So certainly felt at the beginning and at the end, firm and strong. Kathleen saying she gets it more at the beginning, whereas Maria saying linear and consistent throughout. Shengli's acidity is soft and round. Luciana finds it more vertical. Okay, good. I think what's really nice for me as the kind of teacher here is just to see that you guys are really sort of understanding the concepts really well. And I know some of these things, especially the type and the shape of the acidity, are quite abstract concepts, but I think you guys have really got the hang of them. So that's great to see. Okay, so let's, why don't I move my slide forward and see what I came up with for Pinot Gris. Here we are in Alsace. So I'm just being a bit silly about the level of acidity. I'm saying higher than you think. So a lot of people are saying medium, but some of you guys did actually say high. And I guess my point I'm making here is that it's very easy to underestimate the amount of acidity there is in this variety, particularly if you have the Pinot Gris expression. If you have an Italian Pinot Grigio, especially from Alto Adige, then of course it has high acidity, and that's very obvious and anyone can see that. But if you have a Pinot Gris, which has got so much going on in the wine, you've got the rich fruit, you've got the full body, often you've got a bit of oily or viscous texture. You might have a slightly bitter finish. There's a lot going on in that wine, which may distract you from realizing that the acidity is actually a bit higher than you think it is. Because of the body weight and the density of that fruit, which can feel a bit heavy on the palate, you might be tricked into thinking, oh, it's got kind of low acidity or whatever. But like you guys just did, when you really think about it, you realize the acidity is a bit higher than that. And so I would certainly say that in Alsace examples, then most have at least moderate acidity, maybe even more. And probably the same for Oregon as well. The type of acidity, some people here are just commenting on the type of acidity. So zesty, I think someone said. Tingly is a very, if you're not a native English speaker, tingly is a very hard word to explain what it means, but it means it's almost like a little vibration or a kind of brightness in your mouth. I also wrote on that alive, as if it's got some kind of, it's not just sitting quietly and still, it's kind of vibrant and a little alive and a little nervous and nervy and twitchy. That's what tingly is like, I think. Luciana says she likes tingly as well. Okay, and so what's actually quite interesting is that a lot of you guys were sort of in the firm camp like we were for Chardonnay. And I agree with that as well. Firm in the sense that you can detect the acidity all the way through the wine. I don't think that's a problem. But to me, there is a slightly different quality. It's a bit more tingly, a bit more alive than Chardonnay acidity is, just in terms of the type. I think that's an interesting transition. And the reason I find it interesting is because I think the shape of the acidity is almost identical to what we just experienced in the Chardonnay. Look at the terms I'm using. They're basically just copied and pasted from the Chardonnay. But it's the type that is different, right? So that's a kind of interesting comparison. Okay, you guys have got some questions. Let me try and get to these questions. And Catherine's asking, what's the difference between an Oregon Pinot Gris and a New Zealand Pinot Gris? New Zealand, again, climate. When we're talking about the difference between regions, Oregon is a lot warmer than New Zealand. So the wines are bigger, more full-bodied, richer, and more viscous, like Alsace. And New Zealand examples can have residual sugar, 15 grams, 20 grams. So they look like technically like Alsace, but the alcohol and the body weights can be a bit lower, and the fruit has got much greater purity. crystalline purity of fruit, such a New Zealand signature, true in Pinot Gris as much as in Sauvignon Blanc or Pinot Noir from New Zealand. Yeah, and Fred is making the point when we're just mentioning residual sugar. Many of you who've got the Alsace or perhaps even Oregon examples will find a little bit of sugar and you just feel it on the tip of your tongue, a few grams. And that also softens or deadens the sensation of the acidity. So that's another reason why we might underestimate the level of the acidity in the Pinot Gris. Louise is clarifying, compared to Chardonnay, the difference is the type of acidity, zesty versus broad. Yes, Louise, I think this is the key point to understand the difference between these two varieties in terms of acid structure, is that it's the type of acidity that separates them. So remember I was talking about Chardonnay being the reliable friend, just very consistent, steady, firm, but there's a bit more energy here in the Pinot Gris, a bit more going on. And that might be kind of surprising because you might think of Pinot Gris as being a kind of ponderous, heavy variety from Alsace, and Chardonnay being a bit more sprightly and lively in terms of its fruit. But in terms of acid structure, I think it's the other way around. I think that the Pinot Gris has got a bit more energy, the tingly sensation that we're talking about. Fred is saying tingly means it's like it tickles your taste buds, which I love. I think that's very good, Fred. Tickles the inside of your mouth. Luciana is talking about vertical. Let's leave a discussion about vertical and horizontal until next week, when we will have one very vertical variety. Nicole is asking, tingly, does it mean like bubbly in your mouth? Not quite that. It almost means like fizzing, like when, I don't know, when we were young, we might have had like a candy or a sweet where when you put it in your mouth, it sort of bursts and it sizzles and hisses. That's like tingly. It creates these little pricks in the inside of your mouth. Yeah, so tingly is kind of, it's a little bit like zesty, but not perhaps so strong as zesty. More like it's just like Fred says, it just kind of tickles. It just kind of tickles the inside of your mouth. I love that. Okay. If Chardonnay is linear in terms of acid structure, is Pinot Gris more multifaceted? Not in terms of acid structure. We can talk about other components of the wine, Nicole, but I think in terms of acid structure, they're very similar, just with a different type of acid structure, type of acidity. Kathleen's asking, is the acidity still linear if you feel it particularly at the front of the mouth? Well, what I do with Pinot Gris is I always feel the fruit of any wine really right on my tongue. So what I do with this particular wine is I almost put I kind of lift up the tip of my tongue and put it right into the middle of the wine, into the middle of the liquid of the wine. And then I find the acidity just tucked right in there in the middle. So for me, maybe you do find it more at the beginning, but for me, when I do that, I do find it just as much in the middle as I do at the beginning and at the end. Stanislav's Chardonnay has the direction. Pinot Gris is plain and has higher intensity over Chardonnay. I'm not sure what you mean by plain, Stanislav, so you might have to spell that one out for me a little bit more. Pop Rocks is the name of the candy. Thank you, Kathleen. Okay, so Pinot Gris and Riesling. If you have a Pinot Gris and a Riesling, one from Alsace, both from varieties from Alsace, how would you tell them apart? I don't really want to spoil next week's Riesling tasting too much, but in Riesling, you do not get the sense of direction, the sense which we took from Chardonnay of the wine going somewhere, that it's almost like a race from the beginning of the mouth to the end. That never happens in Riesling. That's a huge difference in terms of acid structure. Nicole is saying Skittles are also tingly. Good. Fred is asking about the level of acidity compared to Riesling. I think Riesling always has higher acidity. In Alsace or wherever you grow it, you can put as much texture, body weight, alcohol, fruit on Riesling in Alsace or Austria or anywhere else where they can make quite full-bodied Riesling. but it doesn't change the fundamental point that Riesling acidity is always high. And here in my example of classic, I've got Weinbach Pinot Gris, classic, Alsace Pinot Gris, and it's only moderate acidity. So I think Riesling is always going to win, purely in terms of level of acidity. Luciana says Vinho Verde can also be tingly, and I agree with that. And Stanislav saying tingly as if it's got lots of little sharp points. Yes, but smaller sharp points than the Sauvignon Blanc last week. Even more smaller, more delicate than that. Does temperature change acid structure? It doesn't change. So again, this is a crucial distinction between what's in the glass and how we perceive it. The acid structure of the variety doesn't change according to temperature or according to the style of wine, or whether it's sparkling or still or fortified or sweet. What changes is our perception of it. And if the wine is too warm, then our ability to perceive these details of acid structure, which are very subtle, let us not forget, our ability to perceive those little details is diminished. So the acid structure remains the same, but our ability to perceive it goes down. So I'd always prefer in this kind of tasting to serve these wines cooler rather than warmer. And incidentally, for you wine geeks who've got wine exams coming up, if you keep your wines really, really cold, you can't taste any aromas or flavors anyway, so you have to rely on acid structure. A good tip. Stanislav's saying Pinot Gris almost just feels like a surface, like you're skating along a surface, whereas Chardonnay is more like a kind of a cable of acidity. Maybe, but I find that cable or that line or that string, that taut string of acidity to be the same in both. It's just that you have to fight your way through the fruit a little bit more in Pinot Gris to find that acidity. That's not true, of course, in Pinot Grigio. Someone's got the example of the Alto Adige. In that case, of course, there is nothing to fight through, and the acidity is very, very prominent. It's high acidity in those northern Italian examples. And that's why I've also included this word on here under other terms, electric, because I do think in the best Alto Adige examples, you can get almost electric acidity. So what that is that's an extension of the tingly sensation, or that sort of zesty, tingly, humming sensation taken to another level. Like the step above tingly is electric. When I've done this series of webinars before, I have also added a third variety at this point, which behaves in a similar way, in a similar kind of linear, horizontal way, which is Semillon. I didn't include it this time just because, with the exception of Hunter Valley Semillon from Australia, it's quite a hard variety to find by itself. Usually it's blended. But Semillon, it behaves in just the same way as all this, but it's even more electric and tingly and humming than Pinot Gris. But if you ever want to do this tasting at home, it's a really fun one to do. So you start with Chardonnay, like a Bourgogne Blanc or something like that. And then you go to a Pinot Gris from Alsace, and then you go to a Hunter Valley Semillon to see 3 examples of a linear horizontal acid structure. But in each case, the electricity or the vibrancy or the life of the acidity seems to go up in energy each time. It's super interesting. Okay, so I think that's good for Pinot Gris. So let us move on to our final wine of this session, which is the Italian white wine. Now, I did say to you guys that if you, I was going to suggest a agave, a Cortese, and I'm sure many of you were able to find that, but equally well, because there are so many factors in common with Italian white wines that if you were only able to find another alternative, such as, you know, Pinot Grigio or Verdicchio or Soave, they would also be, they'd also serve a lot of the same purpose. Perhaps not so much like Arnés or Vermentino or Fiano or Greco. Those are slightly different style wines, but these more northern Italian varieties all have got quite a bit in common. So tell me, pour your wine and then tell me what's the flavors and aromas you're getting, and of course tell me what you're drinking. I think most of you will have been able to find agave, but tell me if you're drinking something else. I mean, to me, again, I have to say, I don't find this on the nose to be an aromatic variety. There are many aromatic white varieties in Italy, like the ones I was just mentioning, Greco, Fiano, Vermentino. I think you could safely call those aromatic varieties, but I don't find this one to be abundantly aromatic. So good. It looks like everyone has managed to find agave so far. What aromas and flavors are you picking up? Fred's got La Skolka, an all-time classic. Vidya is saying that in her agave there's pear drop and ripe pears on the nose. Good. Kathleen is getting lemon, bitter almond. I mean, aren't those two so Italian, huh? Lemon and bitter almond, or some kind of almond. Such consistent note across so many northern Italian whites, and a bit of wet stone as well. Good. Shengli, yellow apple and pear. Walnut skin, so again, a nutty note of some kind, a bit different from almond. Peach, good. Herbal notes perhaps, and some salinity, excellent. Light aromas, grass, chalk, apple for Vitali. Floral, light, lemon, lemonade for Stanislavs. Good. And for Maria, slightly savory and mineral, and more expressive at the finish. Good. I mean, pear is quite a common note across these wines as well. I do think that's another classic northern Italian thing. Although one note I would just throw out there, not connected to anything, but just because I'm thinking about it, is that when you get that pear drop note, that can sometimes be because the fermentation, the alcoholic fermentation, has taken place at very low temperatures. And that can, when that happens, you often get this pear drop, sometimes even banana-y note. So that can happen across regions anywhere in the world and across different varieties. So pear, of course, is classic for Northern Italian white. But if you've got another wine with a pear drop note, then don't automatically assume it's an Italian white. It could be a winemaking thing as well. Okay, so let's talk about acidity. What's the level of the acidity in your agave? Moderate for Kathleen, and for Shengli and for Maria. Stanislavs is saying high, the highest of the three. Good point, Stanislavs. Compared to the other two wines, yeah, it could be higher. Probably not higher than Alto Adige Pinot Grigio that someone had, but maybe higher than Oregon or Alsace. And Kathleen and Fred are both going with medium plus. Good. How about the type of the acidity? What's a word that best captures the sensation of that acidity? I mean, for me right now, it's just coming up to 2 o'clock here in the US and on the East Coast. And I'm just tasting this agave now, and just, oh, what a delicious lunchtime drink this is in the sun. Beautiful. So easy to drink, and just a lot of easy pleasure. Okay, Corey's saying high acidity in his agave, medium plus for Luciana, even in fact lower than the Chardonnay and the Pinot Gris. Good. Vidya, high. Electric, bracing for Vidya. Good. Tart, says Fred, tart acidity. So maybe somewhat feels almost like unripe. Firm for Luciana. And Vidya is finding the roller coaster shape up and down. Stanislav says bracing. Another vote for firm. Consistent, Kathleen says zesty for Shengli. Good. Yeah, a few differences here, but there seems to be quite a lot of focus on firm, maybe some consistent, and maybe a little bit of zestiness in that acidity as well. Good. Okay, now finally, the shape of the acidity. I know we're sort of already trespassing on that territory when we start talking about consistent, but do you guys want to add anything about the shape of the acidity? Felt in a particular place in the mouth, or just consistent, or peaks and troughs? Luciana saying firm and broad, which are terms which are familiar to us from the Chardonnay, and is kind of hidden in the fruit, so integrated into the fruit like the Chardonnay, I think Luciana's saying. Kathleen's saying linear, again, recalls to us the previous two wines. Good. Maria agrees, linear and horizontal. Again, we're getting quite familiar with these terms now. Luciana saying she agrees, linear, very like Chardonnay. Okay. Good. Okay, well, it looks like you guys have got this one down. So why don't I just move my slide forward here. This is what I came up with. I haven't been to Garvey, unfortunately, so you have to suffer my picture of Venice instead, where I have been. Okay, so I'm going to go with moderate acidity. If you want to say moderate plus, then I would totally agree with you. I just think I want to avoid going with high, because then I'm start thinking I was at the same level as a Riesling or a Sauvignon Blanc, and I'm not sure I would want to put it that high. For those wines, to me, one of the aspects about having high acidity is that the acidity really is one of the absolute dominant key features of the wine. Whereas here, I think it's just part of the whole. I think it's just part and parcel with the fruit and the body. So I'm going to go with moderate, but if you want to say a bit more than that, I've got no issue with that. The type of acidity, again, I'm going with steady and well integrated. Steady is the same as consistent, I think, same as reliable. And you can see that under the shape of the acidity, I'm confirming that and going with linear here as well. So linear, steady, consistent, reliable, well integrated. We are very much back in the same territory that we've been in for Chardonnay and for Pinot Gris, which is super interesting. Now, how do we distinguish between those three varieties? We talked about the difference between the Chardonnay and the Pinot Gris, the type of acidity, the tingly sensation that you get from the Pinot Gris that you don't get so much in the very firm, steady acidity of the Chardonnay. But how would you, what's the distinction here in the acid structure between the Pinot Gris or the Chardonnay and the Cortese? What do you guys think? So Stanislavs thinks that the Cortese is more broad if Chardonnay is directional. So perhaps you're saying, Stanislavs, that it doesn't quite have the same energy, the same focus, movement towards the finish. Okay. I think one of the very obvious points to me here is that going from the Pinot Gris from Alsace, which is what I had, to a Cortese, is we're losing a lot of body weight. So you remember that I was talking about having really to search around from that for that acidity in the Pinot Gris. Here it's much brighter. I think it really kind of illuminates the whole wine. I sort of, in my mind, imagine like a cylinder of wine, like in my mouth. And here is quite a slim cylinder, quite a light body, a slim cylinder, and in the middle is the acidity, which is kind of giving out light to the rest of the wine. Whereas in the Pinot Gris, there was a very broad, fat cylinder, and in the middle of it, there's this quite energetic, zesty, tingly acidity. So Kathleen is arguing that it's not as integrated as the Chardonnay, and it's got less energy than Pinot Gris. So I completely agree, Kathleen. I think this is one of the key points, not just for Cortese, but also for those other Italian varieties I mentioned at the top, Soave, Verdicchio, those kind of wines from Italy. They don't have that same level of energy as the Pinot Gris we just experienced. And like I was just hinting at, Kathleen, it's not quite as integrated as the Chardonnay is into the body of the wine. I still think it is integrated, but perhaps not quite so effortlessly. And tell me if I'm misinterpreting you. Jean-Luc is saying Cortese is broader and more in the back palate. So under other terms here, I mentioned the words back palate. What do I mean by that? Well, I really want to draw out this idea, which I find very consistent and common in Italian white wines, that they're not wines which are necessarily abundantly fruity, especially when they first hit the palate. And you might think, you know, this is somewhat of a neutral variety. I don't find it to be very expressive. But then after you've swallowed or spat, they really seem to come alive on the finish. Now, part of that is because, I think we might have mentioned this last week, is that Italian white wines, in terms of winemaking, when the grapes are pressed or crushed, they're pressed quite hard, quite firmly to try and extract as much juice as possible. And one of the side effects of that is that you get a bit more skin contact with the juice, which you get a bit more solids in the fermentation vat. And that contributes to this little bit of phenolic sensation on the finish of the wines. Remember last week we were talking about Assyrtiko, and Assyrtiko having a powerful phenolic element to the wine, the kind of chewiness. Of course, we're nowhere near that level with agave, but just on the finish, there's a little bit of bite, a little bit of solid chewiness, and that's the phenolic content from the hard pressing, which is not just unique to Cortese, but it's very common across all Italian white varieties. It's just a kind of national convention, I think. And what that gives, I believe, on the finish is a sense of attack, of freshness. It works hand in hand with the acidity to give a bit of bite, a bit of attack, even though it's on the finish. So I think that's one element of this back palate thing I'm describing. The other element is that somehow that very subtle fruit, because this isn't an abundantly fruity wine, is it? Somehow that subtle fruit seems to come alive on the finish, much more than it does up front. It leaves a kind of delicate floral perfume or fruity perfume on the finish. And actually, in its own little way, it's very attractive. It's very nice, but in a very quiet, understated way that you have to listen carefully to the finish of the wine to register. And again, this is something which I find consistently across different Italian white varieties. For me, they're good examples of a back palate emphasis in white winemaking. Compare, for instance, to maybe a New World Sauvignon Blanc, like a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, where it's all what some people call impact aromas. These big face full of aromas pouring out the glass. But perhaps the finish is less impactful. Whereas here it's the other way around, the back palate wine. So Jean-Luc, a long answer to a short comment. I agree that a lot of the interest of this wine is on the back palate, whereas what we found in the Pinot Gris and the Chardonnay was that it was all the way through. Fred is commenting also on that bitterness. Yeah, and Fred, the phenolics, what I'm calling the phenolics, this chewiness, the sense of the solids in the kind of sea of liquid, which is the wine. The phenolics, yes, that's the bitterness. The chewiness is the bitterness. Just a very slight little hint of bitterness there. And sometimes, although not always, that can go hand in hand with a citrus taste, like a lime or a lemon pith. I'm not necessarily getting that here, but in other varieties, one of which we'll taste next week, we'll experience that. Grapefruit, says Vidya. Yeah, I think that's a good example. Grapefruit, slight bitterness. Yeah, very good. Any other comments about Cortese or Italian whites in general? I think that the wines would behave very similarly if you had a Soave, a Verdicchio. Pinot Gris we've already looked at. The issue that Pinot Grigio has in northern Italy is that you can make wonderful characterful examples, of course, from Collioure and from Alto Adige, but a lot of branded supermarket Pinot Grigios are just extremely high yielding, and they just don't have any concentration. So they're not really good examples of what that variety is capable of. Okay, very good. So let me just move to our final slide. So you can see, of course, by now what the reason why I put these three varieties together. So last week, when we were looking at Chenin Blanc, Sauvignon Blanc, Assyrtiko, you have three wildly different acid structures, very, very different. But here you've got much more commonalities than you have differences. And so you can see that in three very different varieties, and if you expand out the Cortese to incorporate and to stand in for a bunch of other Italian white varieties as well, even more varieties have got this horizontal linear shape. This is clearly a big category of wines that does have this shape. But nonetheless, I don't want to, us to kind of be depressed because all these things have got this similar profile, because I think we can nonetheless still find the differences. What we have seen is the way that Chardonnay and Pinot Gris, they kind of graduate in terms of increasing electricity or energy or tingly sensation. I added to that in passing that the next extension of that is Semillon. That's even more of that effect. And then also, of course, we didn't even discuss the huge amounts of other clues to what the wines are, which you can do without mentioning flavor, body weight, alcohol, dryness, phenolic content, these kind of things. So those are all massive clues as well. So when you combine those things with your understanding of acid structure, then hopefully that's going to help you to understand these varieties a lot more. And then all three show this well integrated acidity into the body of the wine. The reason I mentioned that, and it seems like a not very interesting point, and I keep on going on about it, is because I think that one of the reasons why Chardonnay is such a successful variety, so beloved around the world, is because of how seamlessly integrated the acidity is. It's a kind of a sort of aristocratic quality that Chardonnay has, the fruit and the body and the acidity, and if you use oak well, then all those things can get integrated very seamlessly. Again, we're a world away from Sauvignon Blanc, where the fruit's here and the acidity is over here. And people like Sauvignon Blanc, but there's a lot of people who don't like Sauvignon Blanc. Whereas Chardonnay, I think, can appeal to everyone because of the very seamless integration of the elements. I think that's a real high quality feature of the variety and one of the reasons why it's so successful worldwide. Okay, just a couple of quick questions here. Let's see. Luciana is asking, how can I not get distracted by the oak notes from my Macon when I'm looking for acid shape? Well, in terms, I guess, I mean, of course, like any other flavor and aroma, we can ignore those on the nose or on the palate, but probably what you're getting at, Luciana, is that the oak leaves a little bit of tannin, a little bit of structure that comes from the oak rather than from the acid structure. In that case, what I would encourage you to do is just to think about, you know, if you can get as far as identifying the wine as Chardonnay, to think about the fact that you're looking for an integrated acidity, you're looking right through the heart of the wine, you're looking for that energy in that direction. If you have an oaked, medium to full-bodied white wine with soft fruit, there's a good chance it will be Chardonnay. And in that case, look out to see whether you can search for and discover that linear acidity right through the middle of the wine, and then you're in a pretty good place. Okay, any more questions before we wrap up today? So a very different session from last week, where we're dealing with the world of continuities between different varieties as opposed to huge differences in style. But I think nonetheless quite interesting. Okay, guys, well, I think we'll call it a day at that. Thank you very much for your attendance. I hope you found these three wines interesting. As many times as I do this, I still learn something new every time, and I still find it interesting to think about think about the acid structure and to think about these other elements aside from flavors and aromas that go into making these wines what they are. And at this level, I think that there's so much to talk about. But I'm going to leave you guys with your wines, and you can carry on tasting at home. Same time next week. Look forward to seeing you guys then. Thank you.